Satan is trapped inside a ball of diamonds. Got two but rather small. Zimiar is rather silly art. And moral, but all has no balls at all.
I finally got a proper display case for my turnip lads, and it was shipped with these big sheets of expanded polystyrene. And I figured, you know what, maybe it's about time for me to get into a new game. I've recently grown quite fond of Quar, and Trench Crusade is very popular, so I figured I would try making some World War I trench terrain, which I could potentially use for one and or both of those games. I'm using a hot foam cutter to chop this block into a bunch of various shapes.
Good thing I always keep my trusty gas mask on me to keep me safe from those stinky hun fumes. That gas will almost do as much damage to your sniffer as the smell of an actual kraut, am I right?
I want the layout of my pieces to work for a board size from as small as 2x2 up to as big as 4x4, and I want there to be lanes that sort of represent the various trenches, and then for there to be an open no man's land that separates the two sides. Toothpicks and PVA are used to join together 1-inch layers to give us some height. Then I used a sharp box cutter to carve some steep slopes to recreate the natural incline that trench walls would have. And I saw some other people using Sculptamold to make their muddy earthworks, so I gave that a try, but in everyone else's video, it seemed to have a very pleasant, fluffy, mashed potato type of texture. And I don't know if I did something wrong or if I got a bad batch, but this felt like spreading loose Wendy's chili over a dead fish. It was just very clumpy and chunky and unpleasant, and it did not want to adhere. But I persevered, and I just kept working it until I got to a point that I considered acceptable. And then I let those sit out in the hot, fresh summer air to dry. Here I'm reflattening the bottoms, then I'm knocking off any particularly bumpy clumps. And despite mixing in some dark paint, these guys dried extremely light, but we can fix that with a base coat of a dark chocolatey brown. And that brings us to our first trench fun fact. Here's a cool picture of a Prussian soldier in World War I who was a leather worker before the war, and while he was in the trenches, he skinned and tanned a bunch of rats to make patches to repair uniforms. That's the resourceful kind of guy you want on your team right there. Just don't eat any of his Königsberger Klopse, am I right? I made some sheet metal walls out of corrugated craft paper that I had spray painted chrome, because that was just the one metal spray paint that I already had, and I figured after some weathering it would look like proper dirty old trench corrugated steel. This ended up being semi-disastrous because even after letting it dry overnight, I realized partway into working with it that the chrome was just rubbing off on my fingers, and in hindsight I should have handled this very differently. To add some variation, I taped together some coffee stir sticks to use as small walls of wood boards, and then I stippled on some mud paste to dirty up our fresh, pristine revetment walls. And I got a couple of tones of brown washes, which I applied all over the walls in the mud to tie everything together. Which brings us to fun fact number 2, which is even more horrifying than the last one. In order to combat the real foe of World War I, boredom, German soldiers in field hospitals killed time by playing a popular new board game called Mensch ärgere dich nicht, which, if getting bombarded and shell-shocked wasn't enough, making people play Proto-Sorry, my god, that should have been against the Geneva Conventions. Of all the German board games you could have possibly choose, that might actually be the worst one. Just at least send out a couple of copies of Bonanza at least. In an effort to maximize playability, I decided to not add any craters, but in an effort to simulate scars left by artillery impacts, I splotched on some big black circles to look like scorch marks left by explosions. Then I did some additional wood weathering, and just a little bit more muddying up, and finally some high gloss varnish to make some wet puddles. And that is our trenches done. Next up, I've decided to redo my board. I originally added these resin ponds to visually break up the otherwise very monotonous looking board, but I've come to the conclusion that they aren't worth it because they look like they are intentionally there and distinct so as to maybe represent difficult and or dangerous terrain, which is not what I was going for. So for all the reasons that I liked the look of the ponds, unfortunately it made the board not very useful or good from a gameplay perspective. So I'm going to make the board far more cohesive looking and way less visually busy so that an onlooker's focus will stay on the models and the terrain. Overall, I'm mostly happy with how everything turned out. Unfortunately, the paint is already starting to flake off of the corrugated craft sheets, so at some point I'm going to have to paint over those sections using a proper primer. I'm very excited to sometime soon hopefully force some people to actually play Quar, for which I particularly love the tractors. So I think I'm going to have to add some ADA approved rampage to make it possible for them to actually get up and down the trenches. I also definitely got to make some barricades with sandbags and barbed wire and all that jazz. Anyway, to finish things off, here is a sneak peek of my work-in-progress Trench Crusade warband. I decided to go with Christian as my faction, and I'm going to go with Baptist as my sub-faction. This is Jerry Falwell and his moral majority. Their lore is that they are on a mission to enact as much evil on Earth as possible, so that when they die, they will be sent directly to the very center of hell, where they can take the fight to the Dark Prince of Lust, the abominable, licentious, Tinky Winky.